I hereby call to order this June 23rd, 6 o'clock meeting of the Easthampton Planning Board. My name is James Zarvis. I'm the Vice Chair of the Planning Board, and the regular Chair, Jesse Belcher-Tim, is unavailable tonight. I will be acting as acting Chair. Is there anyone here to speak to anything that is not on the agenda? And I can see that there is no one here except Planning Board members, Zoe, Jeff, and our Ordinance Subcommittee members. So I'm guessing the answer is no. Our first item on our agenda today is something that's being brought to us by the Ordinance Subcommittee. And I'm wondering if you guys want to start your meeting and tell us all about it.
Yeah, well, first of all, I would love to have a motion to get us into session with you guys. So if someone could give me a motion.
It's from your crew, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
That was from your crew. Sorry.
Okay. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Okay, so now that we're in session with you guys, this was actually brought to us by Planner Bag to revisit the restriction in the highway business district on cannabis cultivation facilities not being able to build new structures. Basically, when we were originally doing all of the rules and regulations around cannabis, this was one sticking point where we kind of weren't sure what the future was going to be, whether people were just going to go around the state and just find places where they could put up giant warehouses for really cheap. There was some concern that maybe those warehouses wouldn't be able to be used for anything else, and that they might be blight. And so in a kind of conservative, and I feel like also we were looking at things that were more pressing at the time, we decided to prohibit cannabis cultivation and highway business. And this is basically to revisit that.
Specifically in highway business, nowhere else?
Specifically in highway business.
So downtown business is not a part of what we'll be discussing?
No. Tom.
Sorry.
Yeah, just to clarify, I think my understanding, and Jeff, correct me if I'm here, is that the zoning that we're talking about was basically saying that any thing that was going on in downtown business or highway business had to be in an existing structure, and that we're not at this time we're not talking about changing that for downtown business, but we thought about revising it for highway business. Do I have that right?
You do. Oh, I'm not muted. Okay. Sorry, I was trying to get ready to share my screen. So yes, you are correct. I have a document pulled up that is actually dated today, which is an updated memorandum to kind of cover what will be discussed during the public hearing. And I'll scroll. This is a lot of working on moving at the same time as talking. But I think to your point, Tom, the text in italics shows the way the zoning ordinance got adopted in April of 2018. And in that second sentence, it starts off, the existing language is in the highway business and downtown business, any cannabis establishment other than retail must be located within an existing building and comply with the requirements of 10.5. So for the purposes of starting this public hearing discussion, we are focused on the highway business district, and in bringing to the planning board an initial discussion and ordinance. You know, the focus now is whether or not we want to allow cultivation in new structures in the highway business, and because it makes it a little bit easier to deal with, we're gonna, the scope of this amendment is the highway business. So as of right now, it would still be not allowed, to build cultivation facilities in a new building downtown, and especially downtown. The concern is that someone could demolish something and then construct a new building, and we certainly we're not ready for that. In the highway business, as we discussed, I think even back in 2018, there are vacant parcels, and so that's really kind of there's a entity that is looking at a vacant parcel in the highway business district. So that's what we're really looking to decide, whether to change this.
So I have some questions right off that I'm going to fire out, and if anyone in the planning board has questions, raise your hand. But first off, okay, so I remember this thanks to the power of Easthampton Media, going back and reviewing our old meetings. Thank you, Jeff. And it was an interesting discussion. We punted it then, and I think it's appropriate that we pick up things that we put off so that we dot our I's and cross our T's. In terms of what we're dealing with here, I want to talk about process before we talk about nitty-gritty. We are making a recommendation that's going to the city council. Is that correct? Is that what we're going to be working on?
Correct. Yes, that's my understanding. Yep.
So this document, this draft, has been at work in the ordinance subcommittee. You guys have been working hard to put this together. Am I right? That's where this comes from, this draft?
We've reviewed it. We've reviewed actually a couple of different options. So we haven't actually put together our own draft, but we've reviewed the original draft that had, I think, three or four options on it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what
I think I saw that
discussed.
Yeah, and I think the idea is that the concept, the discussion piece has been identified. However, this is with this joint public hearing, and if it needs to be continued, to talk about the implications and the questions that would come up with it. That has not really happened yet, at least in depth.
Okay, but just so everyone knows, what we'll be doing, we'll be working together to kind of really come up with a better draft that we're going to be voting to recommend to the city. It'll be a vote for recommendation to the city council, right?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay.
And then the city council will hold a public hearing, which is also legally advertised as well. So yes, there's another public hearing that will come after this.
Jeff, before we go too much further, do you want to talk about what happens if something happens to this meeting, that we would continue this to potentially a further date if there's technical problem?
Yep. Thank you very much. That should have happened right away.
I do recall Jesse saying that. I'll have to learn to do that in the future.
I will just say that one thing with the webinar platform, we're a little bit more secure than the normal Zoom meeting where the link is a little bit more broadcast out. But with that said, there was an email earlier today that asked about two dates for if we do need to continue this. The two dates were going to be either July 14th or July 28th. And we didn't really solidify that in advance. So does anyone have any objections to or constraints on either of those dates?
I'm good for both.
Yeah.
Anyone else in the planning board?
Okay. So I think just based on that, we would, let's say, to continue this to July 14th at 6 p.m. in the event that the meeting ends abruptly.
Yep.
Yeah, that was a good idea. Thank you for recommending that.
Thank you very much for thinking of that.
Okay, so let's dive in. Watching that video of what we covered, there was a lot. There was a lot in it. It's looking to me like big box was one of the big questions, and didn't we just recently? I mean, maybe even since this came out, do something with a 50K limit on big box buildings. And one of the questions I have already is, has the landscape changed because of that, or does that not apply?
Salem, you might be the board member who was there for that. It was 2015.
It was about 5 or 6 years ago. We put the 50,000 K retail establishment cap. So there it is. Yep. And really what that was, it was kind of a response to not wanting to have Walmart come into Easthampton. So that was, you can see that it's a single commercial retailer cannot be bigger than, but whether this applies, commercial retailer is a specific category of business. But I think that in spirit, it would probably apply. There would probably have to be some modifications to this. What do you think, Jeff? Would we have to modify this to make it actually solidly apply?
Probably. I mean, I think the reason why this comes up is probably twofold. Is it's a precedent that is already established in the highway business. So we always want to look at that when we're looking at a zoning change that applies to the whole district. In going back to the discussions from 2 years ago, you know, I think it's really under the purpose. So, you know, we're talking about maybe taking something that applied to large scale retail and maybe applying it to cannabis, but I think it's that first purpose. So, you know, consistent with the goals and strategies of the master plan. So I don't really know that there's actually anything that would apply in the master plan, but in terms of retail, it was that we want to encourage small business and, you know, things that are a little bit sustainable. Number two is really something that enhances the district character within the city's primary commercial zone. So I do think that that one has some merit of discussion, whether a large cultivation facility would enhance the character of the district. And then the last one is minimal impact on the environment and municipal cost of service. So at some point during those discussions, I was not there. At some point, a large scale operation, you know, may change the character, and it could, you know, could have an impact to the environment or services. So this
could potentially apply.
Potentially, and I think that's why
in 6.102 with applicability, it says that it's specific to retail and services. And I don't have those definitions open, but cultivation, I doubt, I mean, it could be coupled with retail. I mean, it's possible you could sell and cultivate, and it can be a joint operation, but is service in there somewhere?
Yeah, so that goes to the table of uses that's in the zoning ordinance. None of this is a direct correlation. So it's really just to be perfectly clear that there is this other precedent for retail. And the question is, along the way of this public hearing, do we want to consider applying it or something like it to cannabis? And you know, the chair, Jesse, couldn't be here. And something that he said when basically this was punted, you know, for further discussion, and that's what we're doing now. You know, he articulated something I think is important, is that when we were creating the zoning, we were debating whether or not to allow cannabis cultivation in the highway business. And then what would, if the business failed or the business left and the building was vacant, what could go in there, right? So I have this on my screen here. It's going to take me a minute to maneuver my screen. Let me try to zoom in.
Let me just say that I see Owen, and you'll be right after Jeff, so you don't have to keep holding your hand up.
So I apologize because I see multiple things on my screen right now. I know it's a little blurry, but just to articulate something. So the highway business is the column on the right.
You might have to, you're on your screen share, you might have to go back in and choose the new name.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Does that show the table? Yep. Okay.
Yeah.
So on the right-hand side, you can see at the top is HB. That's the highway business. And those highlighted dashed lines mean that the use is not allowed. And when you go over to the left side and look at the heading, there is wholesale, transportation, and industrial. The first one says processing and treating of raw materials. Maybe it's not the most applicable, but going down, I realize it's blurry. I'm sorry, I'll fix this up for the formal presentation to City Council, but number 9 and number 10 say wholesale, trade, distribution, and general manufacturing uses not commonly considered hazardous or noxious, and they're not allowed in the highway business. So I think that was part of what, why this became too complicated in 2018. And then the last couple are warehousing and just an example of self-storage units. So like right now, self-storage units for warehousing is not allowed in the highway business. So kind of with that backdrop, we kind of start to look at what would a very large cannabis building look like when it's used cannabis, and then what would it look like if that use goes away?
Owen?
That actually kind of answered my question in regards to what use currently looks like in highway business, and and what non-retail applications we currently are seeing. So if, X business wanted to move in tomorrow that was a non-retail business, what would the gross square area limitations look like there? And which I guess goes back to the question of the original intent with the discussion back in 2015, what was the intention? What was the overall intent of restricting that square footage? Was it just that we didn't want big box retail, or we just didn't want large buildings in general?
Yeah, Salem, do you have any recollection of how to respond to intent to that?
Yeah, it was a response to big box retail. At the time there was quite a few, I guess, it was information that was coming out saying that having these big box retailers in your community ended up being a net drain as far as resources that went into them. And we wanted to avoid that because, having extra resources on our police and fire and paramedics and without kind of a good living wage was something we didn't want to encourage.
So for context, because I wanted to provide some context and then have some discussion, and I need, I think, some guidance, like where we might go from here. So I am apologetic to the fact that this got sent to you this afternoon, but I think it is, there's a couple pieces of information I had been gathering for a little while, and I wanted to try to share this document again, if I can get to the right screen. So again, I think Brenda had emailed me looking for some information, and it hadn't been posted to the website. So now the document that we're working off of today is now posted on the planning department page, and we have a section for zoning amendments. So now it's all up there at the beginning of the public hearing. So this document here is what I think in my cover email this afternoon should be like a working document. And I think we can use it as kind of this foundation to build on after discussion, and then whatever gets presented to City Council could kind of be based on this in the discussions. So early on, when this came up, I tried to do a little bit of research. We have a planners listserv. So I asked the planners listserv for people who have in Massachusetts who have permitted cultivation facilities. So I found a couple examples. I'm putting up all the ones I got, except there were a couple that were very, very small and just didn't really help us. But this is a site plan from the town of Bellingham, which shows a 50,000 square foot cultivation facility on a basically it's like a 4-acre site. And so these are just, I'm gonna go, oh, sorry, did someone have a question? I'm just gonna kind of go through these, and then, I appreciate any questions or discussion, but these were the ones that I found pretty quickly through the assistance of the listserv. This is a facility in Amesbury, which showed a 21,000 square foot building on a 2.2 acre site. And it shows this one had the elevations, and there is some variety. There's some variation in what these facilities will end up looking like. This is presumably this is a metal building, but it does look, there are some of these that are glass. So I just going through it before I get bogged down here. There is a facility in Northampton that proposed off of Ryan Road. I think the important thing here is to note it is on a 100-acre parcel, but it is a 145,000 square foot facility. This is just an old gravel quarry. Yep. And then, it is important as part of our understanding of what these buildings might look like without any design criteria. They are generally oriented metal prefab kind of, construction. And then I really thought that we have actually a couple examples right in Easthampton that are at least good reference points. So many of you might be familiar. This is Womelco Way. which is down on Route 10, closer to Big Y. This is an existing building, but for size purposes, it's 16,000 square feet. And then this was approved by the planning board for medical marijuana cultivation, and we are still expecting someone to use the facility for cultivation of adult use. I think what we're hearing now is it may just be cultivation and not retail. But there's a couple designs, and obviously this is an existing building, so these elevations show that there would be maybe some improvements or changes, but it is metal prefab. I think someone just mentioned this, or maybe it was discussed in 2018, but this is Cooke Building Supply. I do have an asterisk on this, that it denotes the building size only, because only a small portion of this was going to be occupied for cultivation. In the picture, it's important to note, if you haven't driven by there, they've started construction. The first barn structure has been demolished and was always slated for demolition, and you can see in the site plan it becomes parking. So just for size and scale references, the building and the barn building in the back and the one with the red roof, it is, I saw Brenda had a question. I can't see everybody. That's 15,000 square feet. So should I pause?
Go ahead.
Pause
Yeah,
for a moment? Okay.
Can't see him when you're talking. So I think you said Brenda had one first. Owen, I'll do you second.
Thanks. Can you refresh my memory? Where are we with the total number of cannabis businesses allowed? It was 6. Was it changed to 8? No, it's 6.
6, and then.
And will the cultivators count towards that?
No, that's all I was gonna say, is it's really, the cap only applies to retail.
But they could apply if they were doing both.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
And then I thought, when I'm screen sharing, I can only see one person. So Owen, did you have a question?
I did. Well, just to clarify, Jeff, the current ordinance that's in place regarding the 50,000 square foot cap, that is per building. In other words, if you had a campus, for lack of a better term, and you had multiple buildings, you could have multiple 50,000 square foot buildings on the property as long as it met other zoning requirements, correct?
I think my understanding of the retail, the way the ordinance is structured now is, my read of it, my understanding of it would be that
Honestly, I'm reaching on that one too. You're throwing me for a bit of a loop with that one. It's a very good question.
I can apply it better to the potential cannabis discussion, which would be that if along the way a building size is worthwhile to establish it, and I do have a slide. I will get there. I think we do need to be cognizant that, let's say you cap it at 30,000, right? Just as an example, we do want to be cognizant that there could be two 30,000 square foot buildings. But I think that'll be okay, because the concern would be that if you have one giant building, the ability to reuse that one giant building would be hard. If you have two 30,000 square foot buildings, you might be able to get a new use to go in someday down the road, because it's a little bit more manageable. I do have a slide to talk about that, actually.
But so to clarify, the answer is yes, that it's per, you can have multiple buildings at the site that each reach the cap limit.
I think I will hazard to say that for the retail, we had some discussions with River Valley Co-op, and I do have a slide for them, but their building is 22,000 square feet. So it's well under the 50,000 square foot retail cap limit. But my best guess, would be that you would not be able to do two 50,000 square foot buildings. I mean, I think if you look at the retail cap, if you're talking about retail, we have an opportunity to make it different for cannabis. So I think we're gonna be better suited to ask that question about cannabis and how you would want it to apply. Mm-hmm. My understanding is if River Valley came in with a 50,000 square foot building, which would be the cap, they would not be able to add another 50,000 square foot building on the same lot because it defeats the purpose of that provision.
I think that there's probably the lots in highway business. Even what the Tasty Top property, I don't know if that would support more than 150,000 square foot, like with the setbacks and.
It might.
There's other applicable restrictions too, right? You have to use no more than 25% of the lot size. And Jeff, correct me if I'm wrong. There are additional restrictions as well.
There are definitely additional restrictions, but I don't. Let me go through the slides. I think I have two more, and then I get to
please do.
The Tasty Top parcel, and I do a little bit about highway business. So let me get through that, and I think it actually.
It's more theoretical then. I guess the answer is if we don't really have any lots that would accommodate that, it doesn't make a difference anyways.
I don't think that's the case though. I think it's part of what we have to get through is more than theoretical. We do have to look at the entire district, and I do think that there are some lots that could. So let me figure out my screen share again. Okay, so this should be Cooke Building Supply.
Yep.
Okay, so again, that front barn in the picture was always slated for demolition and actually just came down this week. And in its place is parking. The barn and the side building together are about 15,000 square feet. So a lot of this is just to get us oriented to some size. This is 41 O'Neill Street, and I'm trying to be really careful to be clear to say that this is not cannabis related, but it shows a 53,000 square foot building addition. So we have a really good ability right now to at least understand what size might look like. So that was the site plan. This is the site plan that was reviewed and approved by the planning board, and it's highlighted in yellow. And if you go on the bike path and want to see it, it's almost done. And this is an image from the bike path looking at the back wall. So again, the site plan here, it is the long wall, but that is a 53,000 square foot building addition. So then here, I will zoom in. This is the site plan for what was then the proposed Stop and Shop. So when we're doing a zoning change that applies in a whole district, we have to, I think everybody has to be really mindful that we're not approving a project, and it could be applicable in other properties. Mm-hmm. However, we do have this example. So this Stop and Shop, it's fairly blurry. I will work on a better quality, but this is I think, I can't read the numbers, I apologize. Let me try to see here. Ay. This total building size, I'm gonna double check, but I believe with the retail and the supermarket says 37,000 square feet. So I think we just need to be mindful. I'm just trying to orient us all to size. I'll double check that and I'll get a cleaner image, but the layout for Stop and Shop would have been, a long entrance driveway, large parking area and building. And so to the page left here is Burger King. And then across the street is Cernak Buick. So then when the Easthampton Advanced Research Park company, they did a community outreach meeting, which was a public meeting that they held last year. Maybe it was last year. They presented slides. I asked them for slides that they presented, and this is the image that they used for their community outreach meeting. So again, this is the same property as Stop and Shop, and you can see Burger King is on the left here, and you have parking up front. Building C, which is shown here as cultivation, is 22,000. A shows 5,000 square foot retail and 5,000 square foot manufacturing. Now, I think this goes to something that Councilor Zarrett mentioned, which I think is really important. This graphic does not show it. However, the driveways and the layout of this lends itself to at least 2 more cultivation buildings of approximately the same size. So if in this discussion, it's about one large building and it could be problematic, but we do want to be aware that there could be multiple smaller buildings. And we're not, for the initial discussion, we're not talking about cumulative square footage. We're talking about a single building size. So I'm going to keep going. I'm almost done. And then just for reference, this is the site plan for River Valley Co-op, which is coming along as under construction, and it's not legible, but the building size is 22,000 square feet. And then where do I end up here? This is the building cap. This is just a snippet of our zoning map. So we need to be cognizant that we're talking about the entire highway business district. So if you're familiar with the project that was recently before the planning board, it was a couple duplexes right here on the edge. So this is Colonial Ave. It's a highway business. You go over the Manhan and take the turn, and then at this side street here, Groveland, I believe, is where highway business starts. And this intersection is Highland Ave and Florence Road, and extends all the way through the intersection of O'Neill. We have Valley Medical is on this end here. So, and there is one more area of highway business out on the very, very end of East Street. Soon you'll be hearing about a Dunkin' Donuts that's getting proposed out there. Then a little bit more zoomed in version. I'm almost done. I apologize, but this is kind of the context. So this is informal. I will make more formal representation of this as we move forward, but the building highlighted in yellow is the post office, which is approximately 41,000 square feet. It appears to be the biggest building in the highway business. Then the final map that I put together shows the highway business in purple. And to the right, to the page right, we have an industrial zoning district that is basically O'Neill Street. And I highlighted the building in blue. I do not know the name of it, but it's 247,000 square feet. So I picked that because it's the largest building in the industrial district. Then across the street in white is the
Is that Tubed Products?
Yeah, that's the Berry Plastic Building. I used to work.
Berry Plastic Building. Thank you. So I think with that, I'm going to stop my screen share for a little bit. And that's the context to which we're looking at this.
And I just want to touch on one thing too that's going to help me frame this. Our current existing state where we are right now is that it bans new construction, right? You only can do cultivation, but only in an existing structure. Is that correct? Am I wrong about that?
Nope, you're correct. So cultivation, manufacturing has to be in an existing building in the highway business.
So really what we're doing is adding some changes to the ordinance to allow for new construction, and that's what we're focusing on.
Yep.
I don't know about you guys, but it sounds to me like what we need to do is figure out what we want and maybe talk about, what we think is appropriate for that area in a way that's fair for everyone that comes in for this use. Now there's some drafts, right? You guys have 3 different options. I saw a document that had some drafts. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we pared it down to the most simplest form. So the amendment before you is to remove highway business from that section. And then part of this discussion is, do you want to add any other criteria to make that happen?
Can we look at the 3 options?
Yep.
And so as far as criteria, we're talking about potentially design standards, size limits, number of buildings, those types of things. Is that what you're talking about, Jeff?
Yes. Yep. I just need 1 second here.
Problem. I figure if we have the criteria, we can look at them, kind of find one that's a good basis, and then really start to go through, each of us maybe take a turn here, what we kind of like and don't like about the criteria that you just mentioned.
Yeah, and maybe before we do that, Salem, would you mind describing I think it's relevant. Do you mind describing the proposed amendment that was put forth by Councilor Kozinski? It
Sure.
applies to the Highway Business District.
It would apply to the Highway Business District. It was specifically related to a buffer between residential properties and a cannabis facility. And I think it was taking a 50-foot buffer and making it 75 feet, or if I remember correctly.
I think it was 25 to 75. No.
25 to 75? Okay.
Yep. Okay. So I think, things like that could be part of what this group thinks about. So this is the language. So it tried to acknowledge that in addition to the language by Councilor Kozinski, we put forward option 1, which was just the most general change. We talked about, there was another option which would have been 2, which would be to just strike it entirely. So there would be no restrictions in the highway business or the downtown, which I would recommend against. And then there was option 3, which at least just started to talk about, what the language could look like. This has some pretty generalized design criteria that had not been discussed. So this talks about one of the ideas, the questions is, would you want one of these cultivation facilities right up against the road? Because if we don't have any guidance or design or restrictions, in theory, it could happen.
Jeff,
we don't know if that's likely, but it could.
So, can you refresh my memory? And maybe I'm off. Maybe it's something that we discussed years ago and nothing ever happened with it. But I feel like we made some changes to highway business not that long ago, and some of them had to do with the orientation of parking lots. Where they had to be. I think originally they had to be behind the building or to the side of the building, and we allowed them to be in the front of the, we changed, and we put in some design standards, like there had to be greenscaping and it had to be pedestrian and bike friendly. Does this ring a bell at all?
A small bell is ringing.
Okay.
I was not here, so it wasn't within the time that I've been here. Without fumbling around too much while we're on this meeting, there is a section of the zoning that applies to the highway business, and maybe that's what got amended.
I think yeah.
So I would need to look at it. There might be some general criteria that already apply. I will say that in 2013, there was a committee established to look at the highway business zoning overall. And I just failed to be able to email that document to everybody today, but a lot of it was about permitting requirements and making sure that we as a community are as business friendly as possible. But there were small things, like I think what you said, Salem. I think there were some small things about landscaping or location of parking that maybe the 2013 plan informed that change. So I would definitely check on that.
Okay.
Okay, so Jeff, did you put I'm sorry, Brunel, just 1 second, you'll be after me. Can you put the 3 options back up? You showed us a table of uses as well. You don't need to put that up. But my assumption is here, from the 3 options I saw, one of them just made a small strike, the other struck out the entire thing. And then the third is kind of like, probably we'll end up going, which is something that we're going to put our own criteria in. I put it in. The table of uses that you showed that it's simply not allowed. Am I to assume that in addition to this change to section 10.10.4.2, from whatever we're doing here, we would also change the table of uses to make it allowed?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's an additional line item that would need to change.
Correct.
Wait, isn't it allowed? Didn't you show under? I thought the table of use allowed cultivation.
I thought they were dashes, right? Maybe I was looking at the wrong thing. Forgive me.
No, I think that was.
Yeah, it was from another table, but under cannabis, cultivation is specifically allowed in highway business. It was in an existing building.
All right. So then it wouldn't need to change. Only this section 10.10.4.2 is where you think.
Actually, yep. Thank you, Salem. Yep, that's right. It is allowed, but the caveat, like, so you look at the table and it's allowed, but then you go to the section and it's only in existing buildings. So yeah, so that's the table doesn't actually need to change.
Okay, Brenda, you had a question.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I'm just wondering about the availability of properties in the other use areas like the industrial zoning districts, things like that. Is this activity in response to the interest that the cannabis company has in the Tasty Top property? Is that what's prompting this?
That is what is, yes, that's what is initiating us to want to look at this.
I'm just wondering about, I haven't looked at all of Easthampton. You have a good take on that. What about, some of the other areas? I'm thinking where like where the brewery is and all that.
Yep. We have not, there has not been a lot of interest so there is an area next to Fort Hill Brewery, I think you're referring to, that is zone industrial. And we have not gotten a lot of interest for cannabis there. I think it's very close to residential uses. So I think, it's just, I don't know why. I shouldn't conjecture why. We have the interest in the highway business for sure. Okay. And then we have INSA, which is operating, which is in the mill industrial. And then that first building that I showed out on Wamelco Way is actually industrially zoned as well.
Right.
So it's been spotty. But the effort here is to, I think within reason, we want to see if we can accommodate a new business coming to Easthampton if it makes sense. And so I think it's if it makes sense is the part that we're going to flesh out.
So what's the definition of industrial? Is it manufacturing? What's what makes something in the industrial zone? Yeah, I'm wondering if you're a cultivator and you're growing crops and you're manufacturing them on site or processing them, is that industrial use?
Yeah, Salem, do you want Salem or Owen? I mean, you guys, we all went through pretty long discussions when this was taking shape.
Yeah.
When you get into a cultivation facility, for the things that we're expecting, it is highly industrialized when you actually see the equipment. But I think there was a conscious decision in 2018 and probably actually before that with the medical marijuana to not automatically push it into an industrial district and only have it available in an industrial district. I think there was some discussion going back to probably as far as 2015 when the medical marijuana regulations came into play. I wasn't here, but I was definitely paying attention to them. And some of the decisions where we don't want to just push this to industrial areas. We want to be able to have it as an opportunity in other areas. And so Salem and Owen were
that a little bit. I think one of the reasons why we made the conscious decision to allow it into the other zones was to kind of spur that mixed use, the creative piece of it. So if someone's going to have a cultivation facility, well, maybe they also want to have a retail and, kind of use INSA's model where they don't have to use big trucks or vans to move it from one place to another. You can have everything kind of in one place So it cuts down on overhead and it's a little bit more creative. And if your cultivation facility is where your store is, you probably don't want it to be an eyesore, you know.
Yeah, right.
There's kind of like sense of place kind of ideas here where, you know, if you have to live with it, you have to live with it every day. That'd be better.
Right. Oh, good. Thank you for that background. I started to watch the video, but I did the 15-minute one, the part 2 that Jeff sent. And so thank you.
I think it's a good question though, Brenda. I think it is part of what we need to make sure we're all agreeing on as a group, that it may have elements that are industrial, but whether it is suitable to put it in the highway business. And I think it all kind of relates to what, if anything, but what regulations would make it suitable, you know, and that's kind of what we're going to kind of work through in this discussion. I saw Tom had a question.
Sure. I just, one thought that I kind of had as we are approaching this, and we start talking about suitability and eyesores and things like that, is that for me to really like want to do legislating there, I would need to hear an argument that some prefab metal building is somehow more of an eyesore or less attractive than a drive-through restaurant or a chain store or a gas station. That's what we've already got in that district. I mean, you know, there's all sorts of important amenities that we have there, but this is not the part of the city that is known for its architectural splendor. You know, it's where the fast food restaurants are. So if you're, you know, in fact, this is right next to our fast food restaurants, right? So if you're telling me that somehow, like, you know, a Burger King with a roof that probably should have been replaced a little while back is somehow not an eyesore, but that a prefab metal building set back against the road, it somehow is. I just, and hey, I'm new to this committee, so maybe there's like a whole line of thinking here that I'm totally ignorant to, but I get a little nervous about sort of that conversation without sort of putting it in the context of what's already there. Does that make any sense?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's an issue of scale is how I'm thinking about it. Is if it was a small, you know, Burger King is, I have no idea how many square feet, but, you know, so I think it's issues of scale. And I think the community really loves the pastures and the view of Mount Tom. And, you know, they've gotten really used to having that golf course be wide open. And so that's how I've been thinking about it is, you know, how can we be business friendly and sensitive to the setting and the environment, and how can we scale it so it's not overwhelming to people as they drive into Easthampton.
Why don't we tackle scale first?
Before we do that though, can I offer something just real quick before we go to scale? So, because I think, unfortunately, the way my brain works is I often have to create buckets of things. So I think what Brenda just said is the scale, you know, I think Tom, you mentioned kind of architecture and like the eyesore. So like there's the visual and the scale part. The part that what I heard a question from you was sort of the uses. And so I do think it's important to just think about highway business. And so we haven't done a lot of changes to our highway business zoning in a long time, but historically highway presumes car. And so we have a lot of these automobile dependent uses that got designated to occur on Route 10. And that's kind of a really rough way to describe the highway business. I do want to pull up, because I think it's meaningful, the way the zoning is structured. And if you can see the table, so about midway down, it's retail service. So when you were describing a couple of the uses, you know, it's generally like in a bucket, it's called goods and services. So it's these things that people can go and get and do. Unfortunately, a lot of this got created in the 60s and 70s, especially the 50s, 60s, and 70s when it was automobile dependent. But if you look at the uses on the left, it starts off with number one is convenience store, discount store, hardware store, garden center, factory outlet store, antique gift shop, shop of a sculptor. So then you have number 8 is like a pharmacy or drugstore. So this is probably kind of remnant from, I would guess, the 90s. I think the Easthampton created a new zoning ordinance in 1995 that had like a sweeping set of changes. So let's pin this to 1995. But number 10 is supermarket, warehouse, club, or supermarket, all other retail, restaurants, like not including drive-ins, and then drive-in or restaurants, bakery, deli, automobile repair, and used car sales. So
everything's very customer centric.
Yes, and so I think that's what if Jesse were here, I think that's what he was articulating. Just is we have to just be cognizant that we add cannabis in, and we get down. So like car washes there. When we get past retail and service, we get into these more industrial uses.
Here we go.
And we want it where the question is, do we want to allow cannabis here? Where this was my point before, is that there's other things. So if you look at probably the best example is, I think Brenda was asking this. So on this page here, number 9, wholesale trade and distribution or general manufacturing uses, they are not currently allowed in the highway business. So a little bit of the disparity that we're going to try to solve with this is, do we allow cultivation in there? And is there a point at which it could change the character? Maybe the character is not perfect now, but could it change the character in another way? So I saw lots of hands. I'll stop. I'm sorry if
I was just going to ask you real quick to go up to the agricultural part.
Yeah.
Because that was the first part before you got into retails, which I think is actually more applicable. And what I think I saw was a straight permit, not even a special permit for some uses that would be comparable. And this is something that our committee's talked about at length, is we want to make sure that the zoning isn't implicitly biased against cannabis, because that's something that we want to try to take out of our zoning, is kind of implicit bias. So if I could grow roses in a new building in highway business, then I should be able to grow cannabis in a new building in highway business. So can we just look at that real quick? Yeah, agriculture.
Yep, we tried to.
So yeah, look, so if you have a year-round greenhouse or farm stand in highway business, that's potentially just a permit, not, and not a special permit from the planning board.
Right.
That is a comparable use with certainty.
Yeah, and to I guess just to be clear, right? So I don't want to be in a position of making uses and creating something that's biased. We do want to know that the state, for the time being, and so we've been working on the cannabis regulations for several years, but the Cannabis Control Commission, there has been determinations that it doesn't qualify for what. So if you do agricultural uses, they're protected and they qualify for certain things, and then there was a choice, not at Easthampton's level, but at the state level, that the cultivation of cannabis does not fall under those agricultural protections. Like, so Chapter 48 has certain protections for agriculture, and there were.
Of course. And that's why we have to put it in specially under cannabis. But in terms of, just like you were looking for comparable spacing and size of a housing, in terms of looking for comparable sections where the same type of thing is happening, I do think it's an absolute correlation. Okay. I think that agricultural is a good example, even though we know you need special, we have to put it in its own category.
Yep, that's fair.
Looks like Owen has his hand up.
Yeah.
Two things. One is, unfortunately, I can't stay on for much longer than like 15 minutes, so I apologize. But I agree with Salem's analogy, even if by the letter of the law, if it's not comparable in terms of MGL, in terms of how they treat cannabis versus straight up agriculture, but in terms of similar uses, a greenhouse that's, again, growing roses, as Chairman Derby stated, and a greenhouse that's growing cannabis, there's really no difference. The other thing is that the use is already permitted. The question at hand is whether we can build a building for it. That's what we were talking about. I feel like we're going down a rabbit hole now that's leading us in a totally different direction. The real question at hand is, if there's no pre-existing building, can you build one in order to cultivate? And by extension, should we place some sort of size restriction on that?
Mm-hmm. Tom?
Yeah, and just to echo what Councilor Zaret said, I think that where I sort of come down on all of this is, if we're using the roses example, if I could, with the right permit, build a building of the same size to grow huge amounts of roses, and Easthampton doesn't see that as an issue, then someone should be able to do the same thing for cannabis. Now, separately from that, if Easthampton decides that certain types of buildings or locations of buildings or whatever are out of character with the highway business district, then I think that is a perfectly fine conversation to have about what kinds of structures you want and setbacks and design standards and things like that. But for me, we've already made a determination that a building just like this one could exist without ruining the neighborhood, because we already allow it as long as it's growing a certain type of plant. But if it's a different type of plant, well, that's not actually going to change anything about what the person driving by is going to experience, right?
Oh, yeah, agreed. Okay, let's try to get some action items. I want to make a statement here, and no fault of you, Jiv. I know you work hard, but a lot of this information for the planning board members did arrive today. But we haven't fully digested all of it, and even though I was a part of the conversation way back when with you guys, I'd like a little bit more time to stew on it. So I think we probably will need to extend this to another hearing. I'm hoping that you're amenable to that. But I would like to get a couple of action items in, at least, set some homework. Maybe just talk on one or two items so that maybe we can flesh it out more at the next meeting. And one of them is definitely about scale, which I think Brenda spoke about at some length. And I want to kind of get the tenor of both the planning board and the ordinance subcommittee of, is 50 sort of the thing you had in mind? And did you have it in mind for total space for a use, which is to say no more than 50 in total buildings? Or, what do you guys think? I want to kind of just go around. Can I start with Austin, actually? Do you have an opinion on a scale?
Yeah, well, I would need to look closer into it and also see if there were height restrictions, but I don't know if we're speaking to a particular site with a view shed in terms of this location with Tasty Top. So I need to read a little more.
Okay, and that's absolutely fair. It is very important that we think about what kinds of things can go into what places, but we also can't base the entire zoning on one particular project. And I think you know that. I'm stating that more for a camera and just so that everyone knows what we're doing. How about you, Brenda? Where are you with scale on this?
Just to echo Austin, I really think I need to, look into this a lot more and understand all the issues. In terms of the scale on Route 10, I think it kind of depends on where the building is situated. I think the other amendment about the setback is important. I think if a 50,000 square foot building was set way back on the golf course, in terms of the view from the road is very different than if it's 75 feet from the road. So I don't know. This is all new information, and I really need to think about it more. I want to drive around town a lot more and really spend some more time. But I really appreciate the comment about the rose analogy. That really helped me get my head around this in a different way. That was really very helpful. So thank you.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you. So, it's clear, I think we all have a little bit more homework to do on it. And this is helping us to frame where we're at. Chris, where are you at?
So where I'm at mentally with it right now is I think 50,000 is a huge building. I've definitely have walked by that the 53,000 square foot building at Adhesive Applications, and it is enormous. I'm wondering, is there some way, you know, when we were doing all of the solar farms, we, you know, there's a decommissioning fund that we put in place because really there's no other use for it if and when it's over. And so it needs to be decommissioned. So if we allow a building of such size, and then in 10 years there's so many cultivators that they just don't need this building and they leave, and there's no other use for this building, is there a way to kind of require a similar decommissioning budget or fund so that if that building has to come down, either they take it down or the city takes it down so it can come back to its normal original conditions?
Jeff, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe, yes, the planning board does have the right to require bonds and such, but the issue really becomes about, will the applicant sue because no other business of that type require, you know, does the greenhouse for the roses require a decommissioning, or cannabis requires it, but the greenhouse for roses doesn't? Tom?
Right, and I love that idea, but my just thought would be that if that's an idea that we want to do, my recommendation would be that that's a separate thing that applies to any structure of that size, regardless of the activity.
Yeah, and that's fair.
I think it's a great idea. I just think, you know, we just should be careful about that.
No,
I would just say don't leave the meeting thinking that that's the cure, because I think the chair of the planning board his quote is my paraphrasing would be that it's a huge burden. So we would expect a lot of concerns from a project developer to come in and be able to have that kind of capital to support the bond. You know, it may be an option, but I just wouldn't.
It's a burden to what, the city or the applicant?
The applicant.
The applicant.
How is it not a burden to a solar farm?
Well, I think luckily for us and solar, it got established in like state, you know, it's established more as a precedent for solar companies. Whereas if we start applying this, I think it goes more to what Councilor Peak said, is it would have to be across the board. Otherwise we are going to be singling out cannabis. It's just not an end all. It's not a silver bullet. I'm
not suggesting it is. I'm just kind of thinking outside the box a little bit.
So one thing that I think is important to acknowledge here, you know, we're talking about a lot of times there are these bigger buildings. You would think that, you know, a big metal building, what other use could it possibly have? But, you know, I've traveled around the country quite a bit coaching basketball, and a lot of these buildings are, when they're industrial buildings, when they're being decommissioned, they turn them into basketball courts or indoor soccer places, like gyms, those types of things. And that's pretty common. I've been through probably 6 or 7 old, metal industrial buildings that they've rehabbed into sporting facilities. Who knows if
now would that be the city would do that, or another private developer? A
private developer bought it and put in, I think the last one was like a 25,000 square foot. They put in, 5 basketball courts and a little,
They do have a lot of reusability. But I think now I'd like to hear about Harry's view on this.
Well, to begin with, there was a Stop and Shop that was approved for that whole area right there. So you can just imagine, to put a building in there for 50,000 square feet, to me wouldn't be any different than having that Stop and Shop. So as far as the view is concerned, what are you looking at? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think so. I don't
what I mean is that whole area is going to have a Stop and Shop and cars coming in and out of there and all that. So to put a building in there for cannabis, I can't understand what the problem would be. And I can't see restricting the thing to have an old building. So the build-move buildings would be okay as far as I'm concerned. You get a state-of-the-art facility, but it's all, whatever it takes to grow that stuff.
I've just been through the planning board getting kind of view on this. I'll just make a quick statement. I'm kind of hoping that we can come out with a discussion next meeting about maybe size cap, maybe the setback discussion should be involved. You know, making sure that all the usual suspects that we cover are involved. That picture that Jeff showed a lot of fans on the side, which did not look like the typical kind of cultivation fans I'm used to seeing. They were much larger and direct, and that led to smell concerns. You know, so I want to make sure that all the usual suspects are in there. Buffer, yeah. So, you know, and then screening is also another potential issue. And I just want to make sure we talk about all these things. But overall, I definitely think we do need to put it back on the docket and get it back into highway business. Salem, do you want to run through your team and get some views?
Well, I think so. We're going to meet next week, and I think it's going to be a good opportunity for us to, you know, take what we've gotten here. And you know, I'm happy to have my guys talk as well. But you know, I think what we're going to do is potentially look at size cap in general, because when we chose, just to be completely frank, when we chose 50,000 square feet, that was what the smallest at the time, what we found through our research, the smallest Walmart that they were willing to build. And you know, and we were. That was kind of our intention at that moment, you know, and when I look at the other buildings and I see the size, you know, when a Stop and Shop is only like 35,000 square feet, maybe 50,000 is too big. I don't know. So we're going to have this discussion, you know, setbacks, you know, sight lines. I think these are things that are good for us to talk about as well. And we're meeting on the 30th at 7 o'clock. Okay. So if anybody wants to jump in on that meeting, everybody's welcome.
But I have a process question though. Now that we're in a joint public hearing, don't we need to make sure that all the discussions stay jointly? I could be wrong, but it seems odd to me that the ordinance could branch off and have separate discussions outside. I think I would just a process question. It seems odd to me that you could convene and have separate discussions that are not out at this public hearing.
Well, we are in the public hearing. But historically, that's never precluded us from going back to the drawing board and meeting as a committee that has this on our agenda. And what we do is we take our findings back to the continued public hearing. So just historically, that's never been an issue.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I was going to say I would see it as no different than continuing a city council public hearing and read and discuss, having ongoing discussions of the item in the appropriate subcommittee, and then bringing it back. So it's also an ongoing agenda item. We haven't taken it off the agenda.
Okay.
I'm not sure. I mean.
And Owen and Tom, do you guys have anything else you want to add?
For now, I think I've said where I am. You know, I just think that talking about structures affecting the character of the district, we should probably be thinking about that in a more universal sense and not exclusively related to cannabis, unless there's something that we can argue is really unique about cannabis versus, to use your example, roses. That's just as we go through it, that's probably the point I'll continue to sort of nag about. So, but yeah, I think this is a really good discussion so far.
I just want to, so let's see, was there anyone else? I would like to be aware of the ordinances meeting to attend and understand what that, I think it's just a little concerning to me, the structure of that and coming back to this joint public hearing that's already been advertised for, so let me process that. I apologize. I do want to make, I will gather some of the information I heard, and I can put a little more structure to the things that I heard, and we can continue to evolve the discussion. I have some objections to the direct correlation of roses. I think we need to be careful that this is a multi-million-dollar industry where properties are getting scooped up, you know, left and right in multiple communities across Massachusetts, not for roses, it's for cannabis cultivation. So I think we just need to make sure, I will continue to articulate that. I think for agricultural purposes, it's fine, but I think we need to be really careful that we see no one constructing new facilities to grow roses, we're seeing them want to construct facilities for cannabis. So I just think that there is something that is different. I'll figure out how to articulate that a little differently, but
You mean like it's speculative, like the gold rush, and there's going to be an overbuilding, and we're left with buildings that aren't being used? Is that?
I mean, my observation is that cannabis is well capitalized, and that's part of what's driving the industry all across Massachusetts. So I just don't want everyone to just compare it to roses and that's it. I think you do have to take some look at what this isn't greenhouses that we would expect to be constructed here. And that's part of the graphics and the articulation of the information I provided in terms of the facilities that are being constructed are not, farmers' greenhouses. They are buildings that have multiple layers of infrastructure attached to
Tom, then Salem.
Owen.
Oh, sorry. Thank you.
Yeah, no, and I get that. And I get that when you have an industry that's this well capitalized, there's the potential to have dumb money coming into things where you have like some people who are throwing money after things really quickly, and then sort of as the industry settles, maybe some of the choices that were made in your community cease to really be the ones that you kind of would have made in the long run. I absolutely get that that's the thing. The only and I also get that there's not a huge rush to build gigantic indoor houses for roses, but I just think I'm using it as and Salem was, I believe, as an example to just say that we're going to be doing these sorts of things about neighborhood sort of character, whatever they are. I think that they should, whatever external features we would like those buildings to have or not have should be universal regardless of what's going on inside them, because we don't know what the next big boom industry that's going to have people buying up huge chunks of land for big prefab buildings is. In 20 years, it could be something different.
Okay.
That makes sense. Thank you. Yep.
I agree. The other thing I just want to remind the other members of Ordinance, and I think you'd agree with me, is that the item that we brought here was regarding whether we could allow new buildings for cannabis cultivation, highway business, and we did not move forward, nor do we have an agenda item regarding any amendments on building size. So if we're going to discuss that, we might need to introduce that if that's something that we're interested in discussing. And also in general about building characteristics, et cetera. This is not the building size, gross area is not currently an ordinance agenda item, just to remind you all.
Well, that's interesting to me because, I saw the three options you had and they were very simple, but the third one seemed to be, broaching into the territory of adding in some modifications. Is it your feeling that if we start to head in that direction that we really need to take this back to City Council right away?
I would argue that not necessarily. Sorry, Owen. There needs to be a decision whether there should be some design criteria for cannabis establishments, and if you say no to that, then yes, you would send something back to council. We don't have a significant time pressure, but we don't have an endless amount of time. We have an entity who wants some understanding of whether this is going to be allowed or not. So I would try to work through. I would encourage us collectively to try a little harder to work through whether there is something that would be applicable to cannabis first. And if nothing else, then yeah, you're gonna have to restart the process. But that's gonna be, we'll be talking about this again in
Well, I have to admit, from what everyone said, the size issue is about a big building blocking the view and not fitting the character. None of that relates specifically to cannabis. That's just about a big building blocking the view and affecting the character. So, I mean, from my perspective, I have an interest in not blocking the view and keeping the character, but it has no relation to cannabis. So I'm not sure why we would discuss that at all in this particular discussion about cannabis. Does anyone have a good reason?
Well, if I understood that correctly, I mean, right now, if there was a retail establishment, a single retailer, they would not be able to construct something over 50,000 square feet. Most other uses that would, I say most, so maybe this is the part that we need to go through the use table a little bit more, but at least if you look at the industrial uses, the ones most likely to have large buildings are not allowed.
Right.
So Salem made a good point. So maybe there could be like a large building to support a sports complex. So I would want to look at that. Or you do have like the Roses scenario. So there are a couple buildings that could go in at an uncapped size, but not all of them. So, and the debate is to whether allow cannabis and whether it should have a cap. So I understand I'm not making a popular point here, but we need to kind of continue down the road about some level of design criteria for cannabis and whether that's helpable.
But I'm not quite sure why, Jeff. I mean, I hear what you're saying is that, wait a minute, we don't have a lot of big buildings allowed at all, and we shouldn't be allowing this in here because it's going to give a way to put big buildings in, and there aren't any, or there are few. And it's really about just stopping big buildings altogether for character. That's fine. We can have that discussion. But about going back to putting criteria in for cannabis, there's nothing unique about cannabis in this that's different than if it's a 50,000 square foot Walmart compared to a 50,000 square foot cannabis facility. I mean, I don't see what's unique about cannabis at all.
I guess I don't want to believe. We should continue the discussion. I think that cannabis has the capability of building large buildings in the present economy. I see that one of our participants, our attendees, raised their hand. And
was that Owen?
No, we have an attendee in the meeting.
Oh,
Thomas.
Who raised their hand. And so because we're in webinar, with the two chairs permission, maybe we could promote the attendee. It's Thomas Malsbury, and I don't know if he has something.
Just so you're aware, Jeff, I don't see any attendees. Are there many?
One.
Okay.
So,
please do. Let's go. Let's hear from him.
So what we're going to do is we're going to promote the attendee to participants so they can decide whether to turn on their camera and speak to the cannabis amendment discussion. So. Thomas, you are going with us.
Oh, there we go.
Okay. So Thomas, if you would like to speak, do you want to turn on your camera or unmute yourself?
Thank you. I didn't mean to short circuit it. I didn't know if you were going to have a public speak section, but just as this discussion was going on.
You're coming in very low. I apologize to interrupt. We're having a real tough time hearing you.
All right.
That's better.
All right, I'm just a little closer. What I've been hearing is it seems like the main question is, from my outsider view, that it seems like, your discussion of this hearing is whether or not to allow it in highway business. And it seems like most of you don't have an issue with that. It seems like the underlying issue is, which should be separate from this, is you guys want to look into establishing criteria for businesses in highway business. So it's a yes, no on, do we want it here? And then before anybody makes an application, do we want to redesign the criteria of what highway business looks like and formalize that?
Yes, you're still very fuzzy. I think I caught the gist of that, and I agree. It's sort of like two big questions. Do we want to put, overall limits on sizes of things in highway business, or are we yes, no in cannabis? Can I just ask your address while we're at it, Mr. Malsbury?
Yes, it's 9 Holyoke Street.
Thank you. Was there anything else you wanted to say? I'm sorry, I only did that because it's so hard to hear you. I wanted to make sure that everyone got a summary, and I hope I did justice to what you said.
Yeah, is this any better? I just moved to another.
Much better, much better.
Sorry, I was just on my laptop out in the room, so I just moved to my webcam.
Yeah.
So my gist was just, it seems like you're grappling with two separate issues that are outside of this scope of this meeting, where one is just the yes, no on highway business allowing new construction for cannabis. versus a general redesign of the character and zoning for highway business. It seems like, where you could put specific criteria on cannabis, I agree that seems arbitrary and not in keeping with what you would want, that it would be a bias against cannabis growers. But it seems like, the scope of this public hearing was just whether or not to allow new buildings, and then it seems like this is drawn out whether or not any new building in highway business should have design criteria that keep in character with scale and viewscape and stuff like that. So that's all I wanted to add. I think you're all talking to that point, but just sort of round robin it. This is my first exposure to this. I was more here just to test the webinar features and just came to that conclusion on my own, that it seems like that the sticking point between all of you is actually outside the scope of what the public meeting was. So that's all I had to say.
Yeah, I think you've nailed it, sir.
Yeah, I guess I would argue that in discussing whether or not to allow cultivation of cannabis in new buildings, you do have the authority to talk about setbacks, design, size. I think it's within the scope in terms of applying it to cannabis. Whether or not you want to do that, I think it's within the scope.
Well, I agree it's within the scope, but I think it's drawn out the question of that this is not a loophole, but it's an open issue that hasn't been addressed since the 50s or 90s when this was last addressed. And, if this is drawn out that there is a potential issue of a 50,000 square foot building being only 25 feet off the highway, maybe you want to address that for all cases, not just this specific case.
Yep. And whether it's a bifurcated process to do something about cannabis, which is a real pressure that we feel, and then deal with highway business, or to just stop everything and just start over. So I appreciate that.
Owen and then Brenda.
I'm going to have to agree there. We have a very specific agenda item in front of us. It's a yes/no question of whether we can build new buildings for cannabis. If we're going to have a discussion about appearances, which up until this point regarding any other industry on highway business we didn't seem to need to have, or square footage, which we have had, those need to be separate agenda items from my perspective. That's what I would feel most comfortable with, and I'm happy to introduce them. I just feel like we are really straying outside the scope of what we've advertised the meeting is about here.
And Brenda?
For me, the difficulty I'm having just saying yes or no on the new construction is I'm having trouble understanding where this type of business falls on that table. If it's an industry, it's not allowed. I don't know what the issue is. So I think it's, where does this business fall in terms of its definition to help me decide whether or not to give it a yes or no? Because I was on board with its agriculture, but then, to Jeff's point, the state doesn't consider it agriculture. So, okay, it's not agriculture. So that's my difficulty, is I need some structure and understanding what type of business this is.
And
I think I saw, hold on one sec, please, Joe. I think I saw Tom briefly. Did you have your hand up, Tom? Then straight to Owen and then to Jeff.
I believe, unless I misread it, I think Jeff showed us the table of uses earlier, and it's in there. So currently it's allowed, it's just only allowed a pre-existing building, which is why we're having this discussion. So it is allowed in its own, and that's a great question, but it is allowed in its strictest definition of what this actually is, which is cannabis cultivation.
Yeah, yep, I agree, and I think it's what in thinking about it, what would you want to compare it to? Like, most people in their line of thinking are going to try to compare it to something, and so that's where I think there's a little bit of a discrepancy as what do you compare it to. But it is a distinct use category that it would be unto itself, cannabis cultivation, and so that's the question, is whether in new buildings is it suitable in the highway business.
Tom?
Yeah, something that Councilor Zaret said kind of clarified something in my head. So just my understanding right now, and this might be a little bit different from what you said, Owen, but we have the option to just say, yes, this would be allowed in a new building in the highway business district. We also would have the ability to say no. We also would have the ability to say in the scope of this discussion that yes, but here are the specific standards that we'd want to see if this were to be allowed.
Yeah.
And so where I'm trying to figure out, what I'm trying to reconcile is that, this probably isn't the time to update like sort of the zoning universally, but I also think that any decisions that we do make here probably should, and maybe it could be after that, but should be applied to other large structures. Unless there's something extremely cannabis specific that would not apply to another large structure. And so, I guess in terms of the sort of the process question and keeping within the scope, I do think that it's fair game to say, that, okay, we would allow them in a new building, but that new building can't be, over a certain number of stories. That building can't, that building has to be set back a certain number of feet. I think that that's all fair game. I'm not saying I necessarily support or don't support any of those decisions, but I think they're fair game. But where I run into trouble is that for me, it just seems that if we're having those discussions because it's a large it's a large structure set up by a well-capitalized industry, well, that isn't necessarily the only large structure that'll ever be set up by a well-capitalized industry. And I think that while we're having these discussions, we should really kind of be thinking about the rest of the district. And if there's something that we think is out of character with the district for cannabis, maybe we can't do that right now, or maybe we need to take some other vote to allow it. But I do think that we also should be thinking about sort of the district as a whole.
I think that was fantastic, Tom, and well said. And I think that's a great thing for us all to stew on. I think it might be time to kind of take some time and think about this and come back to the next meeting with, what we've come about and talked about and learned, and maybe we can decide where we want to go with it. In terms of the next meeting, we just set 2 potential dates for rescheduling, Jeff? How does Councilor Derby?
I put the 14th in my calendar.
Yeah, I would recommend that we try for the 14th at 6. So if that works, we should consider that date.
Yeah. I put the 14th.
You're good with that?
And Jeff, in the meantime, and I hate to add to your pile of work, but is it possible that we can get a copy of that highway business study? And I don't know if there's a way, best practices in highway business for like what I talked, design standards is what I was talking about before. And because not necessarily that we're going to do anything with it, because I agree, Tom, what you said was perfect, but it might be a nice little background information to have in case we do decide to go forward, just as a general highway business review of design standards.
Yeah, that's fine. That's very easy. The business study I will send, and then I think what we talked about before is there is a section that regulates certain things. So I don't know off the top of my head, but so some of the things that we might talk about might already be handled. So parking can't be closer than 25 feet from the street or 10 feet of vegetated setback. So yeah, I'll send that's very easy. I think within reason I can accept, some more requests for general information. I'm willing to I have a list. But what we want to try to do is not reply all and start any kind of, serial conversations, but I'm willing to accept reasonable requests for information that can help us move the dial forward for the 14th.
Knowing the effort involved, I have an unreasonable request for information. There was, I believe, as relayed by Councilor Derby, a motion, or I forget exactly what it was, from Councilor Kaczynski about moving a setback from 25 to 75 feet. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering if we have any ability to determine where in the highway business, what might that preclude as a lot for buildability, if any, in the highway business district.
Yeah, I mean that was some exercises that never, that amendment I think it's getting heard. I think what I heard is Ordinance is starting that discussion soon. Those types of analysis were never done yet, but I think if it's quick, the quick summary is that the proposal that I understood it to be was that there would be a 75-foot setback when it's adjacent to a residential district. So I could be wrong, but what my mind was saying districts. So the highway business, if you remember that map, it's long and narrow, and adjacent to that is residential district. So that would be the buffer that would create a 75-foot setback. That is going to be important when the ordinance, committee looks at that. So I can do a little bit of that. It'll be a general analysis at this point, but I can do that because I think it's important. It relates.
And we're gonna, just for everybody's information, that's gonna be on the 30th. We're gonna be discussing that.
Okay, good. Thank you, Jeff. I did not expect even a partial yes on that one. I know how much work that is. Does anyone else have any recommendations for what we might think about or do for homework on this? No?
And like I said, I'm willing to accept. Send me an email, and it'll just be a reasonable test. I'm happy to do some additional research if you have thoughts. I just, detailed individual site assessments will be harder. That's the kind of thing I'm not sure I'll be able to do. But any other questions, I'm willing to consider them for sure.
Did you say the date was the 14th? Is that of July?
Yep.
At 6 p.m. Is that the only thing on our agenda, Jeff?
Yeah, I think as far as I understand the process, it would be the continuation of this hearing. Yep.
Chris is my normal backup motion maker, but I'm not seeing him in there. Any new blood one of them? Oh, there he is, just in time. So it looks like we need a motion to continue this hearing till July 14th at 6 o'clock.
Oops, I moved to, what is the word again? Sorry.
Continue.
Not postpone the meeting. Continue the meeting to amend Section 1010 to allow cannabis cultivation, manufacturing, research, and development in new buildings in the Highway Business District zoning district to July 14th at 6 p.m.
Is there a second?
Second.
Do you want to do a roll call vote? I know you're doing this new voting system, Jeff.
Yeah,
do I do it?
I think it'd be good to do the roll call for this.
All right. Then I'm going to, now I think Jesse's taken the time to put an alphabetical list together. I'm going by how you guys are on my screen. So if it's not alphabetical, please forgive me. But Austin appears to be first. Yay or nay?
Yeah.
Brenda, yay or nay?
Yay.
Chris, yay or nay?
Aye.
Harry, yay or nay?
Yay.
And I'm yay as well. Okay. Salem?
Tom, let's continue this. You want to make a motion to continue to the 14th for me?
Yeah, motion to continue to the 14th.
Okay, I'll second it. Thomas Peak.
Aye.
Salem Derby. Aye. Yeah, we're good. So again, we are gonna, and I hope it doesn't make you feel too uncomfortable, Jeff, but I think we probably will end up discussing little pieces of this at our meeting on the 30th, because it does kind of dovetail with the setback as well. So, but anything that any sort of new novel information that we get, we'll send to you and the planning board.
Okay.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Great.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So,
Thank you. Have a good night,
Thank you,
everybody.
well, hold on. We have to adjourn our meeting.
Motion to adjourn.
Is there a
Motion to
second?
adjourn.
Need a second.
Second.
Brenda seconds. Yay or nay? Sorry, Austin.
Yay.
Brenda, yay or nay?
Yay.
Harry, yay or nay?
Yay.
Chris, yay or nay?
Aye. Yes.
Yes, and I'm yay as well. We are adjourned. Thank you very much, Planning Board.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Wait, so do we need to separately do it?
Yeah, let's do it.
Motion to adjourn.
Second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Well, there's two of us. We're good. All right.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.